Thanks very much. Thanks for coming. Thanks for having me. Thanks for bringing me down or up. I keep on doing that. I've only been here 3 years already, and I still don't have it straight. And thanks to Jody and the team at the Institute for bringing me here. So let me give a brief intro. This is a sort of a post version of a chapter in this book, The Climate Challenge Society, which is co-authored by John Dryzek, who's now at University of Canberra, and Dick Norgard from Cal Berkeley. It's out last year from Oxford. So I should, on the one hand, credit them for co-authoring the original chapter, but also release them from any responsibility for what I'm about to say. Part of the point of that book is to lay out a research agenda for thinking about adaptation, thinking about the challenges post-mitigation of climate change. And there are a variety of things we talk about in this issue of environmental management in the Anthropocene is one, but we laid this out as this research agenda. I'm sort of taking up our own challenge by pushing that chapter a bit further. And so that's what this is. So there's actually a subtitle of this talk, and it comes from a film called Beasts of the Southern Wild. And in the movie, a Katrina-like storm is barreling towards the Louisiana Bayou, where the main characters, a little 6-year-old girl named Hushpuppi and her father, live. So as the storm approaches, the father doesn't flee like so many of his neighbors. Instead, he hunkers down in their shack. He puts floaties on Hushpuppi and sets her in a little boat, well, it's really kind of a wooden box, and tells her, if the storm waters come up, you'll just float away, and you'll be safe, you won't drown. So after the storm, which Batters and I do encourage people to see the movie, it's really a great piece, they venture out in a boat made out of the back of a pickup truck, which is there, and they look at the decimation, including all the animals that have drowned. And Hushpuppi laments, and this is sort of one of the things about this movie, what comes out of this 6-year-old's mouth, for the animals that didn't have a dad to put them in the boat, the end of the world already happened. They're all down below, trying to breathe through water. So the dad, of course, is this metaphor for environmental management, how we protect what we see as the most important thing in the world from the various storms that are coming, increasingly from our own making. So this is the dilemma of environmental management. In the Anthropocene, we've created this storm, so how can we also build these boats to protect ourselves, to protect the animals, both human and non-human? So the argument here is that a lot of the old groundings for environmental management, especially our favorites, are no longer really helpful. People still try and use them, and so I'm critical of some discourses that are still being used. Some of the frameworks that are being developed are a bit frightening, but we really have to take them seriously. So I'll talk a little bit about geo and bio and even human engineering. In a sense, what I'm trying to do in this particular paper is to scan what my good friend Tim Luke in the US calls the Anthropocenery, to try and understand what the Anthropocene is going to look like to us, and then sketch out 4 different potential responses, 4 different sort of ethical or normative frameworks for environmental management in this new era. So I start a little bit after defining the Anthropocene. I'll talk a little bit about the preferred discourse, a long-standing discourse of limits and boundaries. Boundaries is the new big thing. We'll talk a little bit about that. My argument there is it's a really nice idea, but politically, it's a failure and is doomed to failure. And I get a lot of feedback on that one. Not as much as this. I go on to some other traditional approaches to environmental management. And the problem, of course, is that environments are changing. What we mean by environment is now unstable. The very makeup, the functioning, the evolution of ecosystems and habitats are both impacted and uncertain. So if there's one thing that I know I'll get some feedback on, and I've had some angry folks, and I speak from experience here, it's that there's no going back. And this classic idea that so much environmental management is based on, the past, a regeneration of the past, a management along the lines of the past, that classic grounding, that idealization is over. And with it, ideas of wilderness and preservation. And the Anthropocene spells the end of the use of those concepts. So if those two norms are out, how do we respond to the Anthropocene? So I do talk a bit about some more radical measures, not so much, but there's a lot about the sort of tech-heavy and Promethean hubris-imbued notions of geoengineering to limit the impacts of climate change, bioengineering of human beings and non-human beings to make us more amenable to the coming or changes that are already here. Now, that all said, it's not all doom and gloom. There's a lot out there in my field about more positive, less techno-nightmarish views of human, non-human relations and of environmental management, adaptive management, co-evolution, ecological rationality. All of these things have been suggested as forms of some sort of interplay between human beings and the environments that they manage. But the problem is that while people in environmental politics and theory have been laying out these ideas for years, their application has been quite limited. And so I've been thinking a bit about the blockage there. And so the talk ends with a discussion about a concept or an ethic that would enable such forms of ecological management, and that's this notion of ecological receptivity. And that gets at this basic idea of the recognition of the human immersion in the rest of the non-human world, and I'll talk a bit about that. But I close then a bit more positively with this idea for an ethical and really a pragmatic grounding for environmental management. So, first up, the Anthropocene. There's been a lot written on the idea. I've given this talk a couple of times, and people have wanted just a quick intro to the Anthropocene, so I'll do that a bit. People may not remember, but Bill McKibben of 350.org got his start. His very first piece of writing on climate change was this book called The End of Nature, where it was basically about the Anthropocene. He didn't use that term, but the argument was the same, that we no longer have anything that's natural, that what we have in Earth systems is entirely human-created. More scientifically then, you had Crutzen and Stormer put forth this original argument in 2000, that we're actually entering a new ecological age, a new geological age. And it's this point where if you're a geologist in the future, you can look back and you can literally, the argument goes, see the line in the sand, see the line on the planet where human, I won't say control, that's too much, but human impact on Earth systems becomes obvious. And that's the rationale for the development of this new geologic era. As Deepesh Chakrabarty argues, human beings now act with the force of geophysics. We're like tectonic plates on the planet, or volcanoes. Clive Hamilton calls us the Earth Masters. And we've already geoengineered our way into a climate-changed planet. We've moved, in a sense, from being serial depleters, human beings moving from place to place and depleting areas, to something that's a bit more serious in terms of scale and impact. And the bottom line here is that the Anthropocene will not recede until human beings do. And so the central question of environmental management is whether we are capable of developing ways to manage ecosystems, to manage animal habitats, to manage human needs. Can we figure out what it means to be the dad that puts the animals back in the boat? So the first response of the four that I want to talk about is an old and favorite discourse in environmental politics. It's the language of limits and more recently of boundaries. So in 2009, a group of prominent scientists led by Johan Rockström, writing in Nature, argued that there are 9 key planetary boundaries, and they're in the figure there, that quote, must not be transgressed. These boundaries define what they call the safe operating space for humanity with respect to a variety of Earth systems. So their plea is to keep us from crossing these thresholds or these boundaries that would, they say, push the Earth outside the stable environmental state of the Holocene with consequences that are detrimental or even catastrophic for large parts of the world. And of course, since then, there's recognition that we have transgressed a number of those boundaries already. So this follows a long history of the limits to growth, which has really been part of the environmental and conservationist discourse for decades now. We continue to have arguments about growth, slow growth, anti-growth. George Monbiot actually just published this week a piece in The Guardian talking about growth and stopping growth and why we don't focus on the growth question. Now, the political problem here is that we've been talking about this language. We've been using this discourse of limits to growth for 40 years, and it's really come to nothing. And it's actually worse than that. The problem is a political, structural one, and so this is the political science-y part of me coming out. Limits discourse faces immediate opposition. However justifiable it is in economic terms and in ecological terms, and I don't question that, so don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that these ideas are wrong. I'm saying they're politically not viable. However justifiable they are, there are dominant actors, especially in states, not just in the economic realm, that simply cannot buy into talk of boundaries. Any environmental advocate can attest to the backlash an anti-growth or limits to growth argument gets, right? You greenies are out to kill jobs and you're out to kill the environment. How many times in the last 40 years have we heard that kind of response? Actually, ex-PM Howard equated all climate science last year to the limits of growth, like the Club of Rome, the original limits to growth argument. It may be, okay, an idiotic comparison, but it's being made and it's constantly being made. Look, governments have an imperative for growth. They have an imperative, they have to provide, they have to collect taxes, they have to provide for jobs. States must do that. If there's a threat to that, states will respond to that. So you cannot talk to states using a limits language. Politically, it's just not feasible. This is why a lot of environmental groups have switched to green growth and green jobs and the whole idea of ecological modernization. It gets away from the limits argument, and you've had a bit more success there, but of course that's all being shut down here now. Sorry. But the problem is that the metaphor just doesn't work in the political arena. So after Rockstrom et al. Put that argument together about boundaries, they brought it down to the Rio +20. Planetary boundaries, the idea of planetary boundaries was put in the first draft, but of course, as soon as the governments saw this draft, it was removed from the language. So whatever the scientific merits, this idea of boundaries and limits as a guiding discourse for the Anthropocene will always be politically problematic. Now, you may make the argument that, well, let's just get politics to listen to the real world and adopt some sort of limits or degrowth discourse. Maybe you want to make that argument. Maybe we continue to make that argument. But 30 years of sustainable development negotiations, over 20 on CO2, clearly illustrate the problem with that kind of normative grounding. So I don't think it's going to be a useful normative grounding for an idea of environmental management in the Anthropocene. So what else do we have in the toolbox? The past. So this is the second approach to environmental management, and it has a different sort of problem. It's realistic, but for more sort of, it's not realistic, I should say, but more for ecological reasons than for political ones. So the response here is to go old school, to focus on the sort of traditional discourse of environmental management. Here, the Anthropocene is understood as a problem, as a condition to be administered by bureaucracies bringing in ecological expertise. And what kind of ecological expertise? Well, this kind of management has traditionally been based on knowledge of the past, right? The historical rate of snowmelt and the flow of rivers, the range and migration of various flora and fauna, the history of size and take and species in fisheries. So environmental management has long taken the past as the standard around which conservation and restoration are designed. This connection to history, this sort of reverence for the past, is deeply embedded in terms like preservation or conservation biology or restoration ecology. And yet this move into the Anthropocene, out of the stability of the Holocene, undermines this traditional knowledge base. It snatches away this compass. Fish are moving down the coast, spring is coming early, nothing is like it was, and nor will it ever be again. Right? Even insurance companies, take your cue from insurance companies. Insurance companies are basing actuary tables no longer on the past. Right? I mean, this is a big deal here with the floods, right? It's not about what the traditional floods are anymore. All the insurance companies are thinking about the future. So they've taken this trusty compass of the past away, even from the actuary tables. So the use of the past as a sort of baseline to be restored or to be mimicked just won't work anymore. But we see figures in conservation trying to come to terms with this, but there's this sort of conflict. So we have some major scientists or scientists in major groups like the Nature Conservatory in the US arguing that, and it's a quote, conservation's continuing focus upon preserving islands of Holocene ecosystems in the age of the Anthropocene is both anachronistic and counterproductive. These are major conservation biologists writing for one of the major groups. But that old school does not die easily. And so in response, you have other ecologists fearing the spread of the acceptance of the Anthropocene, saying it's going to undermine both conservation and restoration objectives. And so they make the suggestion that conservationists just stop talking about the Anthropocene, right? Focus on pristine ecosystems that are unaffected by human activity, as if there is such a thing left on the planet. That's a very, let's say, an idea with a very short half-life and limited application. But that's the battle going on. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't restore ecosystems. It doesn't mean that we don't protect ecosystems. And the example that I like to use here is the Society for Ecological Restoration. The field originally defined itself as focused on moving ecological systems, and this is a quote, back to indigenous historic ecosystem conditions. That was the definition of the society, of the task, of the mission for the Society for Ecological Restoration. In this incarnation, ecological restoration was just this idea. Take systems back to pre-development, to pre-European settlement. So I used to live in Arizona, northern Arizona. There's a society, or there's an Institute for Ecological Restoration up there that focuses on ponderosa pine forests. 40 years they spent working out how you restore ponderosa pine forests. And basically what it was is you find the old stumps because there's no humidity up there. The stumps from 200-300 years are still there. You let a tree grow next to an old stump, you mow the rest of them down, you let the grasslands go, and you reintroduce a fire system. Great idea for restoring ponderosa pine forests. What's the problem? The climate in the American Southwest is drying and warming. Those ponderosa trees will not grow at that altitude in 20 to 30 years. All of that work was for naught. They will not restore those ponderosa pine ecosystems. Right? So you've got new ecosystems moving up the mountain. Now, the Society for Ecological Restoration did something extraordinary. It completely redefined its mission. So now, ecological restoration is about the process of assisting in the recovery of an ecosystem that has been damaged, degraded, or destroyed. They're interested in restoring the functioning of ecosystems, and they use the notions of functioning and restoring the integrity of a working ecosystem. This is what ecological restoration is now. So history might be important, but it's not the model. History is sort of a cultural lesson. What could a functioning ecosystem look like? Let's look at the way that some others were in some other places. So there's a little bit of a place for history, but not this graphic reproduction as my old friends in Arizona used to do. But the nostalgia for the past remains, right? And this is where we get this idea of rewilding, which is really frustrating to me. So the idea of rewilding and bringing back some sort of classic megafauna or their closely surviving relatives back to places where they've been eliminated. So this is Monbiot again, who wants to see more elephants in Europe. So you reintroduce missing plants, you reintroduce missing animals, and then you step back, and this is the interesting part. You step back and allow the rewilding to occur. You let nature take its course at that point. But the problem, of course, is that the environments aren't there that can support these animals that are being reintroduced. Right? Should we really let elephants or other megafauna loose in an environment that's changed to the point where it could no longer sustain them? And the rewilding idea goes a bit further with the de-extinction movement, which is sort of a combination of this elevation of the past and some of the ecotech stuff that I'll get to, just sort of using the DNA of extinct animals, bringing them back and putting them back where they were. So it's this sort of, it's the fidelity to the past and this technological hubris as well. But you still have the same problem, bringing animals back to places that no longer have the ecosystems, no longer have the support systems for those animals. So let me move to another sometimes frightening but growing discourse on environmental management. The two that I talked about so far take some sort of defensive posture. They look at the damage caused by the Anthropocene. They hope to reverse in some way and to protect ecological systems from the worst of the impacts of the Anthropocene. But there's another way to look at the Anthropocene, and that's at human ability to impact global systems and the working of natural and ecological systems and individuals. And I guess the simple way to put this is in this approach, this sort of human hubris, the technological hubris, is an opportunity. Now, the most obvious one here is the idea of geoengineering. Geoengineering is touted as a potential response to climate change in the Anthropocene, one that does embrace this hubris of the age by extending and expanding human power to engineer planetary climate systems. But the idea doesn't stop there. There are those out there arguing that we should bioengineer and redesign the human species itself, maybe other animals, actually not even maybe, definitely other animals, that research is already being done, to adapt them, to help them adapt to new environments. So if the Anthropocene is that scene from The Beasts of the Southern Wild that I described at the beginning, geoengineering sort of aims to smooth the storm so there won't be so many of them, and bioengineering aims to sort of redesign ourselves or other animals so that we're more like the boats or something like that. So I'm going to assume a general knowledge of of geoengineering, this claim that we can manipulate the atmosphere or the oceans in some way to protect ourselves. Right? The main one is sort of spewing particles into the atmosphere to reflect the light and the heat. Now, criticism of the approach comes in a lot of different forms, and I'll just talk about a couple of them. Steve Gardner, who'll actually be in Sydney for a talk in July, has attacked this idea that we can arm the future, as he says, with this sort of preparation for geoengineering. He's concerned, as a philosopher, he's concerned with the kind of moral corruption of current generations as we appear to diminish our own responsibility for creating this climate challenge world. If we just say we have the technology, we can fix it, then we don't think about the impacts. And so geoengineering itself is a moral hazard that takes this responsibility away from us. Clive Hamilton, as he does, has an interesting approach. He offers the pros and cons of geoengineering. Right? On the one hand, we've already geoengineered. Right? The Anthropocene and climate change are already examples that we can do it. Right? We have the ability to affect global systems. We've already engineered every other environment, right? So why don't we keep on doing the same? But on the other hand, our knowledge does have its limits. So how can we truly engineer a system that we really don't understand how it works? And so it's this sort of faith in hubris, Clive argues, that seems to be the litmus test with whether you support geoengineering or whether it freaks you out, right? Do we really know what the hell we're doing? So geoengineering is a very old-fashioned technological fix Prometheanism, but it's this increasingly discussed model of environmental management for the Anthropocene. And I'll send around, we're having a couple of day workshop on geoengineering in Sydney, July 29th and 30th. Philosophers are fun because they never stop there. So there's another set of philosophers, Matt Liao at NYU, who sort of looked at this idea of, if we have this hubris, why stop with geoengineering? Why don't we talk about human engineering? Or what he calls the biomedical modification of human beings to make them better at mitigating, I'd say, adapting to climate change. So this could include taking pills to develop an aversion to meat. And you think this is a joke, but he actually got a phone call from a pharmaceutical company in the US asking about the intellectual property rights to develop this idea. Taking pills, that would actually go over really well. Right? Take a pill to not want the steak that's on your plate. Or taking pills to enhance altruism or empathy. I don't think they came after him for that, interestingly enough. We could manipulate human DNA, so we develop cat-like eyes. We have cat-like eyes. We don't need as much energy to light the rooms that we're in, so we lower our carbon footprint. Or why not go even further and directly shrink the actual footprint of human beings and just make us smaller, right? So we have an actual smaller footprint. Rather than manage the entire global system to provide an environment fit for human beings in their current form, let's just manipulate human beings to fit into the environment that we've made for ourselves. So thinking about Hush Puppy again, I have this image of engineering biological floaties, right? Just sort of injecting pufferfish cells into the biceps of people that live along the coasts, right? So they can sort of inflate their arms when the waters come up. See, I say that so that some company will come to me and ask me for the intellectual property rights. I mean, we already manipulate our bodies in a lot of ways, for vanity, for health, right? Why not for adaptation? And we think that's silly, but this is already happening in the non-human realm, right? We're already engineering non-human beings. So forget de-extinction. Let's redesign species for their new environments. So I came across this art project by a French photographer, Vincent Fournier. It's aptly entitled Post-Natural History. And he did the work in conjunction with a geneticist. So it takes on the idea that we need to assist other animals to survive climate change through synthetic biology and genetic engineering. So ideas include what a frost-resistant ibis, that part I never got. Why focus on the ibis? I don't know. Fungi that grow in arid environments, or armored mammals with metallic scales that help them maintain their body temperature in a warming climate. Now, you may think that's a great art project, but we're already doing such things. Right? A couple of weeks ago, came across a newspaper article. There are American geneticists working with chickens in the US to try and make a new breed of chicken. They're trying to bring an African strain into the American broiler chicken so that they can deal with more heat. So you have a chicken that won't collapse as the temperatures go up. It's research that's going on. This is serious research that's being done to engineer animals that will adapt to climate change. One of the places in the US on my to-visit list is a place called the Center for Post-Natural History. They maintain, it's like a museum, they maintain a full catalog of living, preserved, and documented species of what they call post-natural origin, from Dahlia sheep to transgenic mosquitoes. And they're using those up here, right? Transgenic mosquitoes. And soon, of course, chickens designed for climate change. So engineering nature, bioengineering is already an environmental management strategy, right? We may think this is sort of crazy stuff, but it's already out there, right? After the storm, Hush Puppy talks about the animals down below trying to breathe through the water. Well, maybe we'll do that. Maybe we'll sort of reawaken whatever genetics are necessary to bring the gills back to the animals so they can breathe in the water. I have no problem thinking that people are already working on that problem somewhere else, maybe even here. And of course, that's just about individual animals. We're already thinking about this in terms of full ecosystems as well, right? Redesigning reef systems, bringing in new species so that a reef can survive a hotter water temperature or a higher acidity level or higher ocean level. This isn't fanciful. This is a profession, right? There is, of course, it's always the Americans. I can say this as an American. There's an American Ecological Engineering Society, right, complete with a journal on ecological engineering, focused originally on sustainability, but it's moving into more biotech and synthetic ecologies. One of the commentaries on Fournier's project said, "For nature to survive, it may have to become artificial." And that's one direction we're moving. In an essay that Bruno Latour wrote called Love Your Monsters, of course it's a reference to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Latour makes the argument that the environment is exactly what should be even more managed, taken up, cared for, stewarded, in brief, integrated and internalized in the very fabric of the polity. So he makes this argument that with modernization, with technology, comes this responsibility to care for the monsters we've created, not fear their continued refinement. So assisting animals to survive by changing their very genetic makeup, right? Is this another unethical act, or is it the most ethical thing that we can do for all the species that we're currently forcing into extinction? It may seem a bit crazy, but again, I have sort of no doubt that this is actually going to be an increasing area of environmental management. I want to end on a bit of a different note, and hopefully a bit more constructive one. The final idea for environmental management in the Anthropocene is one that, again, sort of looks at some of these ideas for more ecological management, adaptive management systems, co-evolution, as my colleague Dick Norgard argues, rather than control over Earth systems in the Anthropocene. And I have this picture from The Economist up here because even The Economist, which is sort of the epitome of this sort of technological and ecological hubris, notes the necessity of, quote, finding ways to apply human muscle with the grain of nature rather than against it. So that means working with the process of ecosystems rather than seeking to dominate them. It requires some sort of ethics, some sort of heightened critical reflexivity about the relationship between the human and the non-human, a constant awareness of the systems in which we're immersed. I think these are all sort of fairly obvious things that scholars have articulated but haven't achieved, right? We haven't had any sort of success, right? We're not reflexive in the sense. And one of the things I'm working on now is some sort of expression of this ethics. So let me, again, finish up with this idea. So in one sense, the whole idea of the Anthropocene is about sight. Right? The whole idea is that we can see, we will see in the future, this shift in the human environment, in the environment of the Earth. That this new era is something that will be physically visible itself. Now, I'm curious about how we bring that sight, that vision, that receptivity into the public realm. So I have a few examples, right? So you guys don't do this so much here. The graduation speech is a really big deal in the US, and there are all these examples of really famous graduation speeches. And the novelist, David Foster Wallace, has one of the ones that's always called one of the best graduation speeches of all time. And actually, I encourage you to listen to it. It's really an amazing thing. But he talks about this kind, or a kind of receptivity. He calls it simple awareness. And it's basically a lesson for liberal arts students who are graduating, what kind of things you need to pay attention to. So it begins with a parable, an apt parable, after seeing the video screen downstairs. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and eventually one of them looks over at the other and says, "What the hell is water?" So the whole point for Wallace and this speech is that it's a challenge to be aware all of the time about everything that you are immersed in, everything that is going on around you, and that you need to train yourself to pay attention and to always see the water. And this is the essence of what I'm calling, or what others call, a critical receptivity. I think this sort of awareness of the Anthropocene, the changes to the water can be a key way to be reminded constantly, to be constantly aware of what we have made for ourselves and what we will be thoroughly immersed in. Now, one of the problems with Wallace's talk is that he didn't get at how it is that we come to forget about the water, right? It's great to be aware, but how did we learn to forget? How did we learn to forget about the ecological conditions of everyday life? So let's call this 5 minutes. Let's call this immersive ignorance, being in the water without seeing it. And that's basically where we are without a realization of the reality of climate change and the Anthropocene. So there's this great novel. This is one of the great things about moving to Sydney. I've been immersed, using the metaphor again, with these environmental humanities folks. And so as a political scientist, a political theorist, to use novels and essays, this is a new thing, and I'm having a blast with it. But Chana Miéville wrote this really fantastic book called The City and the City. And it's sort of it's a literary view of this idea of immersive ignorance. The setting of the book, and the geographers love this, the setting of the book is two cities that actually share the same physical space. Two cities that exist in the same physical space. They can only exist as distinct from one another if the citizens of each city learn not to see the people and the buildings of the other city. They overlap, they share the same geographical space, but the citizens literally learn to make invisible those citizens of the other city. And so it's a murder mystery, and somebody gets killed in one city and dumped in another, and so they have to sort of figure out how to cross the borders of the city in solving the crime. But learning, and this is the key, learning in these cities is aimed at making what we're immersed in every day, the streets that we walk down, right, making them invisible. And that invisibility is taught, it's expected, it's enforced. There's a police force that works across the boundary. So Miéville's work is often used to illustrate the way that we make the poor or others, the homeless, invisible, right? We step over them as we walk down the street. The industrial age has been, in part, about making invisible and blocking out the reality of the environment in which our everyday lives are immersed. We're taught absolute blindness to that city, the natural systems that we walk through. So the lesson of Wallace's parable, the lesson of Miéville's fiction, is to learn how to notice the water, the city, the environment in which we're immersed, those things that are normally invisible that we can choose to see. And again, this, I think, is what the Anthropocene is about, and this is a potential ethic for the basis of environmental management in the Anthropocene. And there are a lot of folks in my field in environmental political theory that talk about this idea of receptivity. It's been around for a while. Andy Dobson has just written a whole book on listening in democratic theory, talking about attentiveness. But it's not just listening, it's something more than listening. It's the development of all the receptive capacities. There are a lot of folks that talk about listening to the signals from nature. Australia's own Val Plumwood had this great line about listening to the remote as a part of understanding the environment in which we're based. But there's an environmental politics of sight, I think, that's developing around this idea. And I'll just give two quick examples as I wrap up. Tim Pagerotte has this amazing book about the industrialized system of slaughter in the US. This is great for the PhD students in the room. He worked in an abattoir for 6 months undercover as his field research. And he wrote a book not just about how we make meat invisible as we're walking down the supermarket, right, and it's wrapped up and it doesn't look like meat, but how the animals themselves, how life is made invisible even to the workers in these abattoirs. It's an amazing piece, and he says that his hope is that the book will be a detailed account of industrialized killing that will invite readers to seek a more thoughtful relationship with the non-human creatures with whom we share the planet. It's a study about how we make invisible, but it's also a political statement, an idea of this politics of sight. The other example I use, I don't know if people go to Sydney very often, but the folks at the grounds have introduced a petting zoo as you walk in. And part of the petting zoo is this pig, and the pig's name is Kevin Bacon. And I think it's a phenomenal idea, right, to have a pig at a restaurant that serves pork pies and egg and bacon sandwiches. And the kids pet the pig on the way in, and his name is Bacon. Now, the vegans in Sydney didn't take too kindly to this. He was actually kidnapped and brought down to Victoria and released in an animal protection area. He was rescued and brought back. But I think the vegans missed the point, right? The whole idea that kids are going to see this animal, that we're making visible, the grounds is making visible these animals. And the response, I think, is brilliant. I don't have the picture, but they brought some chickens in, and the chickens' names are Poached and Scrambled. So I think that this kind of receptivity is really key to the design of sustainable environmental management. This idea of ecological receptivity, this reflexive perspective, requires us to live with a constant awareness of environmental systems in which we're immersed. To me, it's a bit more politically viable than a limits approach. It's more ecologically viable as a grounding than this sort of grasping for the past that we see in some environmental management. It's more ethically, I think, viable than the kind of technological hubris that's out there to redesign the earth, humans, and all the rest of the animals in it. So one way or another, we'll find out if human beings are capable of putting such an ethic to work, whether we can sort of jointly, with the flow of ecological processes, design and co-manage an Anthropocene. Thanks.